Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and a very good day everyone. This week we'll be looking at analyzing arguments. Basically, this is the content for this week topic. First, we'll be looking at diagramming short arguments, and of course, the second one is summarizing longer arguments. And there are three subtopics that fall underneath: paraphrasing, finding missing premises and conclusions, as well as summarizing extended arguments. Now, let us talk about the first part of this topic, which is diagramming short arguments. Now, to analyze an argument is to basically break down into various parts. That is what analysis is all about. And the reason of doing so is number one, to see clearly what conclusion is defended, and also number two, on what grounds. So, diagramming is a quick and easy way to analyze relatively short arguments. Now, how do we define a short argument? So, roughly about a paragraph in length or lesser. Now, let us start with the first type of diagramming for short argument. The first one is basically for independent support. Now, what does it mean by independent support? If once you have an argument with you, the first thing that you need to do is to break them down, also break the argument down into few parts. What are these parts? Basically, they are statements. Why do we need to break them into few parts? So that it'll be much easier for us to identify what are the premises and what is basically the conclusion. Also, by breaking down into parts, we will have the opportunity perhaps to disregard few statements which are not related or which are not relevant to the conclusion. So let us look at the first example here. The death penalty should be abolished because it is racially discriminatory. There is no evidence that it is a more effective deterrent than life imprisonment, and innocent people may be executed by mistake. Now, this is basically the given excerpt or the given argument. Your job is number one, to identify what are the statements in this argument and how do they function. That is to identify what is the conclusion and what are the premises. So in this case, we can see that number one, so we number them. We number the statements. So the first statement, which is the death penalty should be abolished. Basically, that is your argument. That is something that you want. That is something that you desire for. So we number them. We number it number one. And number two is the second statement after the word because it is racially discriminatory. And then of course the third one, and then of course the fourth one. Now, identifying these statements by labeling or numbering them, it helps you to understand which functions as a conclusion and which function as the premises. So in this case, as you can see, whatever that appears after the conjunction because are basically premises in order to support the given conclusion. What is basically a conclusion? The death penalty should be abolished. So that is your conclusion. How to support your conclusion? You are given three premises. And if you look at these three premises, they are basically independent. What does it mean? They function on their own and all of three are relevant to the conclusion, although they are not interconnected with each other. So the diagram should be something as appears on this screen. Now, number two is link support. Sometimes you may have premises that are basically supporting each other and or they are interconnected, and the two premises are basically supporting the conclusion given. Now, let us look at this given example here. Every member of the Applewood Association is more than 50 years old. Bob is a member of the Applewood Association, so Bob is more than 50 years old. So as you can see here, so Bob is more than 50 years old. After the word so, that statement is basically the conclusion. So you have, of course, you have numbered all the statements, and it seems that number three or statement number three is the conclusion. And of course, you have statement number one and statement number two. As you can see here, every member of the Applewood Association is more than 50 5 years old. Bob is a member of the Applewood Association. So you can see that there is a connection between statement number 1 and statement number 2. So when the premises are linked together, they are considered as linked support. So we can have, or we can add the additional symbol in order to show that the first premise and the second premise, they are linked or they are interconnected, and therefore both premises are supporting the conclusion. The third one is another example where you have the same idea, which is link support, or the same concept. However, one of the premises does not support the conclusion. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we can have in an argument where a statement may not be supporting the conclusion, may be irrelevant to the conclusion, or may exist with no notion to the conclusion. So we have basically an example here. If Amy runs marathons, she is probably very fit. Amy does run marathons. She's also a B student, so Amy probably is very fit. So the first thing that you need to do is, of course, to number each statement. Now, as you can see here, we have about 4 statements here. And after the word so is basically the conclusion. So statement number 4 is basically your conclusion. So you have 3 premises to support, or uh, presumably to support the conclusion. However, you notice that number 3 is out of topic, irrelevant to the conclusion. So we need to disregard statement number 3, because being a B student does not have to do with any probably fit. So that is why analysis allows you to understand the function of for each statement, and also to assess whether each statement is relevant to the conclusion. So by disregarding number 2, by disregarding number 3, you can have 2 premises, which is number 1 and number 2, and they are linked together or interconnected, and they are supporting statement number 4, which happens to be the conclusion. Another example for link support is where you have the first conclusion that acts as a premise and to the second conclusion. Okay, now I give you an example here. Jim is a senior citizen, so Jim probably does not like hip hop. So you have the word so, and as I mentioned to you, after the word so is basically the conclusion. But the third statement also has the word so. So Jim probably won't be going to the Jay-Z concert this weekend. So you have 3 statements here. You know that one functions as a premise and 2 function as the conclusion. But you realize that one of the conclusion functions as the premise to the second conclusion. So in this case, number 1 is basically the premise, number 2 is basically the first conclusion, and number 1 is basically supporting number 2. And now that we are supporting number 3 as the conclusion, number 2 change its role from being a conclusion to the statement number 1, has now become the premise, or the support for the second conclusion, which is statement number 3. So the diagram is illustrated as such. Now, this is also another good example on how on us for me to show to all of you how you can have 2 arguments in a one big argument. All right, where you have 2 arguments in one big argument, and the first conclusion of the first argument will function as one of the premises in order to support the second conclusion of the second argument. Now let us look at the given example. Most Democrats are liberals, and Senator Dumdiddle is a Democrat. Thus, Senator Dumdiddle is probably a liberal. So the after the word thus is basically the conclusion. The fourth is Senator Dumdiddle probably supports affirmative action in higher education, because most liberals support affirmative action in higher education. So you can see that number 4 acts as the conclusion for the second argument. You can, if you analyze this excerpt properly, you realize there are basically 2 arguments mentioned in this one excerpt. The first one talks about senator and being a Democrat, and the second one talks about you know the senator takes in terms of higher education or affirmative action in higher education. So once you have labeled them or number each statement, you realize that number one and number two, they act as a premise for the first argument and derive to a conclusion which is the statement number three. Now, moving to the second argument, you realize that number three is basically supporting number five in order to come to the conclusion which is labeled as number four. And the diagram is illustrated as such. Now, I would like you to read on tips on diagramming arguments. There are a few tips mentioned by the author on page 169 in the textbook. It's very important for you to refer to the textbook and read on this. Now let us move on to the longer arguments. So we have covered the first part of this chapter, which is we look at the shorter arguments. Now, what if we have longer arguments? So how do we analyze them? Must we use diagramming in order for us to analyze longer arguments? I bet if you have longer arguments like a 1 page in length or 2 pages in length, then it will be very hard for you to actually come out with, or if you even manage to come up with diagrams, there will be lots of diagrams for you to analyze. So how do we go about? We can use the first method, which is paraphrasing. Now, because many arguments are expressed in ways that are needlessly worded or complex or obscure, it is often necessary to restate them in ways that are simpler and easier to understand. Now, a paraphrase is a detailed statement of a passage using different words and phrases. So a good paraphrase is basically number one, accurate, number two, clear, number three, concise, and number four, charitable. We'll be looking at some explanations on these four. Now, a good paraphrase is accurate. So the first virtue of a good paraphrase is that it is accurate. An accurate paraphrase means that faithful to an author's intended meaning. It reproduces that meaning fairly and without bias or distortion. Now, in a way of saying this, that when we paraphrase a statement or when we paraphrase an excerpt, our intention or we should be paraphrasing those statements or that excerpt by not changing its meaning. This is what is meant by accuracy in paraphrasing. Number two, a good paraphrase is clear. Arguments are often expressed in language that is needlessly wordy or confusing. Because one of the basic aims of an argument summary is to clarify what an argument is saying, so it is often necessary to translate, paraphrase, complex or confusing language into language that's easier to understand. Meaning to say, if let's say the explanation or the written argument is very complex, using words that only certain people understand, you may want to change that into layman's term in a way that everyone understands. Of course, the third one is a good paraphrase is concise. A good summary captures the essence of an argument. It strips away all the irrelevant and or unimportant details and puts the key points of the argument in a nutshell. So to lay bare the essence of an argument, it is often necessary to paraphrase portions that can be stated more briefly than they are by the author. And the last one, a paraphrase or a good paraphrase has to be charitable. It is often possible to interpret a passage in more than one way. In such cases, the principle of charity requires that we interpret the passage as charitably as the evidence reasonably permits. Now, I have just explained to you all four criteria of a good paraphrasing or of a good paraphrase. But then again, you need to understand this criteria by looking at examples. So please go on pages 176 to 178 in the textbook for you to understand better on the examples given. Now, second is finding missing premises and conclusions. Now, in real life, people often leave parts of their arguments unstated. Now, this is very true. Now, sometimes a premise is left unstated. Now, let us look at give an example here. Store clerk. I'm sorry, I can't sell you any beer. You are under 21. So what is implied here? What is the premise that you should have the premise, but it was not stated, or it is not stated, but it is implied. I can't sell beer to anyone under 20. So that means it's your principle. You cannot sell beer under 21, to people who are under 21. And that is not stated, but it should be there as one of the premises, but it is not stated. Now, this is what we call this is what we called an implied premise. What about an implied conclusion? Now, this is another example. Advertisement. The bigger the burger, the better the burger. Burgers are bigger at Burger King. So what is the implied conclusion? As you can see, at one glance, you realize, I don't see any conclusion here, but there is. It is not stated. That means it is implied. And what is implied? What the implied conclusion is? Burgers are better at Burger King. Now, there are many reasons why a premise or a conclusion might be implied rather than stated. Now, sometimes the missing statement is something so obvious and familiar that it would be tedious to state it explicitly. Like in the case of the given example just now about the burger. At other times, an arguer may leave a premise or a conclusion unstated because he wishes to conceal a weak or questionable step in his argument. It's like a camouflage. In order to ensure the winning of the argument, some of the premises or perhaps the conclusion is not mentioned or stated. An argument with a missing premise or a conclusion, it is called as antheming. So I would like you to, of course, refer to your textbook on page 180 to 181. Look at the two basic rules in filling in missing steps in enthememes. And the last one is summarizing extended arguments. Now, this method is called standardization. Why? It consists of restating an argument in standard logical form. Now, an argument is said to be in standard logical form when each step in the argument is numbered consecutively. Premises are stated above the conclusions they are claimed to support, and justifications are provided for each conclusion in the argument. Now, let us look at the ways to standardize an extended argument. Number one, read through the argument carefully and try to identify its main conclusion. Now, it may be only implied. Once you have identified the main conclusion, go back through the argument to identify major premises and sub-conclusions offered in support of the main conclusions. Paraphrase as needed to clarify meaning. Number two, omit any unnecessary or irrelevant material. Focus only on the key points in the argument. Omit any statements that provide little or no direct support for the main conclusion. The third one, number the steps in the argument and stack them in correct logical order, i.e., with the premises placed above the conclusions they are intended to support. State the main conclusion last. Fourth, fill in any key missing premises or conclusions. Don't worry about filling in all missing steps in the argument. Include only those missing premises or conclusions that are important in understanding and evaluating the central argument. Now, place brackets around implied statements to indicate that they have been added to the argument. And add parenthetical justifications for each conclusion in the argument. In other words, for each conclusion or sub-conclusion, indicate in parentheses from which previous lines in the argument the conclusion or sub-conclusions is claimed to directly follow. Now, read on common mistakes. I would like you to read on common mistakes to avoid in standardizing arguments on page 187. Now, all those pages that I've mentioned that are not included in this slide or in this lecture video, you are needed to read them because they can be out in your final test.